Hello, and welcome to this month's episode of People Unfiltered, Sin pelos en la lengua. This is a no-holds-barred conversation on the critical issues that are facing the DEI community today. I'm Evelyn Espinal, CEO of Ideas Global, and today I'm joined by Bo Young Lee. Bo is a true thought leader, activist, and trailblazer in the field of DEI. Bo, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's an honor and pleasure to be here.
We have a very unique audience. It tends to be people that are practitioners in DEI who perhaps don't have the largest network, who perhaps don't necessarily have the academic background, but they really want to stay ahead of the issues that they're dealing with in corporate America. And I think it's so special that we have you with your background and the huge credentials that you bring. So I'd love it if you could talk a bit about your origin story. Tell us what is the thing that got you inspired and interested in DEI work, and what's motivating you to do the work that you do today?
Yeah, absolutely. And first, as I want to repeat myself, like it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm want to say hello to all the listeners. And it's an interesting thing that you said your listeners are people who are maybe don't have the biggest network, or are getting started in this journey. It's a theme that I hear a lot from practitioners that I mentor and just new people out there. I get a lot of outreach and ping through LinkedIn and other places. And I think this sense of disenfranchisement, or not disenfranchisement, but this like disaggregation of the community is a really strong one that we should address. But going to your question, sort of what's my origin story and where did I really start? So the most direct journey, there's like actually two versions of my story, but like the most direct version is that, I had, I'm an immigrant to the United States. I came here when I was a child with my family. And, we grew up incredibly economically poor. Like I was a free lunch kid. At one point in time, we were on welfare. We had food stamps for a short while when we were just getting things started. And my parents were like the classic, they worked 7 days a week. They took, I think, 1 day off per year on Christmas. They worked like 80, 90 hours a week, small business owners. And, that informed a lot of the way that I viewed the world. But even more so than that lived experience, something that really shaped the way that I thought about the world is actually my parents, and specifically my father. So both my parents were born in Korea during Japanese colonial occupational rule. So they grew up in just tremendously like impoverished conditions and oppressed conditions. And they were both also born during World War II. And then as they were growing up, my dad became a North Korean refugee because his family came from the northern part of the peninsula, and my mother became a war orphan during the Korean War. Both her parents had passed away by the time she was 8, and so she grew up in a lot of poverty. And their stories of thriving and trying to live in these really wretched conditions, I think, gave me a sense of the broader world outside of the cocoon of the US that I was raised in. But even with that kind of background, I never really thought that I would work in like this space of diversity, equity, inclusion, partially because it wasn't a field when I certainly was studying at university. I went to college thinking that I would become a behavioral economist, decided that I did not want to get my PhD when I was in school, and decided, I have no idea what I wanted to do. So like a lot of smart kids who go to college don't know what they want to do, I became a management consultant right out of university. I did that for about 4 or 5 years, still had no clue what they wanted to do. So what does a smart kid who has a few years of management consulting under their belt do when they're still kind of lost? They go and get their MBA. So that's what I did. The next step, very traditional, a management consulting to an MBA. And it was really in that process of getting an MBA that I found my passion for this work that ultimately became diversity, equity, and inclusion. And it really stemmed from the fact that when I was getting my MBA back in 2001, women made up about 23% of the MBA population. And even more so than just being a woman, being a minoritized woman, being a queer person, being a person with a disability, being an immigrant, I was very othered in that MBA process. And, you'd be sitting there doing case studies, and every case study that we studied in school was usually had a protagonist who was a 40, 50-year-old white man, cis heterosexual. And I sat there going, I'm studying basically, and I'm being taught basically to be a white man. That was the model of leadership that I was being taught, in my MBA program. And I've always had a streak in me, maybe from my parent. I always had a very rebellious streak. And so I'd be sitting there 2001, 26 years old, raising my hand going, these case studies are great, but what about me? What does someone like me have to do to be successful? And at that point in time, 24 years ago, no one had asked that question. How do people who are not part of the majority succeed? And so it was in that process where I started doing my own research, and I stumbled onto this very small field, which at the time wasn't even called DEI, it was called Women in Leadership. So I began doing my own research. I found that there were a few nonprofits that did this work. And I made the decision at that time that despite taking $80,000 worth of student debt to get my MBA, I was going to graduate and start working at a nonprofit. And that's just what I did. I graduated, I had my $80,000 worth of debt, and I went and joined Catalyst, which had started in the 1960s. And they were one of the few organizations really focused on how do women succeed in business. And I want to believe, like, I've been doing this work now for 24 years, and I want to believe that somehow I had foresight that DEI would have this incredible impact on society. I did it. It was a very selfish decision. I was like, how do I succeed? How do people like you, Evelyn, succeed? And it was simply that one question that I really wanted to answer that led me down this path.
I absolutely love that story. I identify in it so many ways. Immigrant parents for me as well. Right out of college, working as a management consulting, trying to understand what am I about. And then I got my master's in applied behavioral science, and it had a focus on racial justice. And that was the way that I entered into the DEI world. And of course, first it was just diversity, then it was D&I, and then eventually DEI, right? So we've been living the evolution of all of this work.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's this thread in you around one, curiosity, and the other, the value of education. So I know that now you're pursuing a new area of education, and you're looking at artificial intelligence and ethics in a program with Cambridge University. Can you talk to us a little bit about the program, but also what made you decide that that's the next horizon for you in your development?
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think you actually touched on this a little bit, is you talk about the evolution of this work that we've been doing. And I mentioned that when I started the work, like, it was women in leadership. It wasn't like DEI, and it became diversity. Then it became diversity and inclusion. And then it became diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think this world of like applied ethics in artificial intelligence is really the next evolution of this work. And so for anyone who's been paying attention, there's so much research coming out every single day around both, the application of artificial intelligence, but also the ways in which artificial intelligence reflect the societal biases that already exist, right? And so it's not, a lot of people will say, oh, we're building this better, newer form of human intelligence, but we're actually not. We're just replicating human intelligence, increasing the computational strength, like, power of human intelligence, and replicating every single bias that exists. So whether it is biases about gender, we know that there's research that shows that artificial intelligence, large language models, are replicating the same bias stereotype views about women when it comes to emotional assignment. Like, women are more emotional, they cry more, they do all these kinds of things. Men are more angry, more, so they're replicating all these things, even when the artificial intelligence, and the research shows this, even when artificial intelligence is presented with data that defies the stereotypes that it was trained into believing, it still leans into those stereotype beliefs. And so I think looking at the ethical application and the responsible application of AI is an extension of our work. And I think that given the power, the computational power of artificial intelligence, if we're just in the dawn of artificial intelligence, and then we don't raise these concerns, and if we don't put in the safeguards, the implications of it will be beyond anything that we've seen in society. And like, the example I always say is, like, if you take one racist cop, right? They could harass and racially profile 1,000 people in their lifetime, and like make their life kind of miserable in their lifetime. Okay, so that's one racist cop. But if you take a racist, unintentionally racist artificial intelligence that is used within the criminal justice system, they could potentially criminalize millions of people within a matter of months because of the computational difference. Like, like the data centers and the computational power of artificial intelligence is something like 4 million x that of a human brain. And so that's the reason why I started really like looking into algorithmic fairness and AI ethics and responsible AI, because I just think about like, I've always been looking at systems that are designed to either, or rather, I've always looked at who is this system designed to benefit, right? And now I'm like, okay, take that to the next step. Who is this artificial intelligence designed to benefit, and who does it inadvertently harm along the way?
It's staggering, and it makes me a little bit fearful of what's to come. But it also makes me think about the DEI practitioner and what skill do we need to have in those people so that they're not only adapting and adopting AI, but also asking the kind of questions that your response to me just provokes, right? It's not just accepting it at face value and now how quickly do we roll it out, but it's also asking these questions about, is this doing a disservice to the work that we're actually trying to do?
Yeah. It's interesting because I think one of the biggest challenges about being a DEI practitioner is that it's not a singular field, right? People come here from so many different lenses. Like I came through a very corporate business lens, and I was trained to think in terms of finance and accounting and business models. You also came through a very corporate route, but then you took a more like psychosocial approach to it, right? And that influences the way that you approach the work. There are people who come through the civil rights, and I know a lot of great DEI practitioners who were once civil rights attorneys or employment lawyers, and they'll see it through a legal lens. And so I think that the hardest part about when we think about what skills and capabilities is that every DEI practitioner needs to think about what is their orientation based on their educational and work experience, but then what is it that they're lacking. And what I have seen is in the last probably 5, 6, 7 years, and especially after the whole like blow up in 2020 with like the anti-racism, we saw a lot of people coming in through a very social justice lens. And the thing that I find those individuals who came through a more social justice lens is they have such a great concrete understanding around systems of oppression, and they understand how they come from a very sociological, psychological lens. But what they don't always have is the quantitative side of it, right? They don't understand like, how do I utilize data to advance the work of DEI? And I think the thing about artificial intelligence in particular is that, and this is something that I'm learning through my master's program, is that I have a lot of knowledge from a psychosocial perspective. I have a lot of corporate knowledge as well about how change management works within systems. But what I don't have and what I do need to build are my technical skills. So in addition to doing this master's program, I am also taking a coding class. I'm learning Python, which if anybody knows anything about me, like me and like coding are like two separate ends of a spectrum, but I'm learning. I'm forcing myself as a almost 50-year-old practitioner to code in Python. And not because I think I'll ever become a coder. I'm never going to become a coder, but I need to understand the zeros and ones and the digital side of how AI is created in order to be able to like help regulate it and help govern it. I also am learning. I'm in a 12-week course on top of everything else I'm doing. I'm in a 12-week course through the University of Michigan, where I'm learning how to do machine learning research and training. So that's another aspect, because what we know is that the data that is used to train artificial intelligence shapes what artificial intelligence understands of the world. And so if you're putting in data that is fundamentally biased, the artificial intelligence is going to reflect that. And I'll give you a really, really great example of this. So I was writing a paper and I stumbled upon this incredible case study of how historical bias works its way into an artificial intelligence system, even when the humans who designed that system worked really hard to try to remove the bias. And so there was a case. So Optum Health is one of the largest health management systems and companies in the world, in the United States in particular. And it's a system that is used by hundreds of hospital systems across the world. And they created an artificial intelligence to help make recommendations for healthcare interventions for various different populations and patients. And the designers of this Optum AI system were very intentional. They knew that there's bias, racial, ethnic bias in the system. They know that historically Black patients have been underserved and have been provided with less healthcare than other populations, and particularly white populations. And so very intentionally and with a lot of good intention, they created a system where they specifically asked the system and trained the system to not consider race when making recommendations about healthcare utilization and healthcare distribution. They did all the things that they thought they would do, put it into the system, turn the system on. And even with all of the various different forms of human reinforcement training, human reinforcement guidance, the system kept popping up results where it was objectively making choices that resulted in underinvestment and underinvestment of healthcare to Black patients you can say over utilization and overspend of healthcare on white patients, even when objectively the data shows that Black patients had worse healthcare outcomes and therefore deserved and needed more healthcare. The artificial intelligence was consistently under spending and under recommending healthcare spend there. And what that just basically tells you is no matter how much you try to design from the historical inequities, because all the data, all the hundreds of years of data that we have about healthcare spend shows that these kinds of patients get more and these kind of patients get less, it's gonna replicate it. And so how do DEI practitioners, how would you advise in that situation? And a DEI practitioner needs to know how to advise in that situation. Like, I've gone so far as to even believe that one of the biggest mistakes we made is that we even trained artificial intelligence on old medical textbooks and old medical files. I'm like, maybe you shouldn't have even trained on those. Maybe you should have come up with data sets that were completely artificial, but that showed an unbiased, approach to medicine. That might have been better than using historical data sources.
Because having them unlearn this information, this data, is harder than doing it correctly from scratch.
Right. And that's a controversial point of view, right? This idea that we withhold data from artificial intelligence so that they don't actually understand the full world. Right? Like people, like some DEI practitioners and some people may have heard of this term as like artificial general intelligence, which is this idea that we can create an artificial intelligence that mimics human capability. Because what you have to actually understand right now is that every form of artificial intelligence that people engage with right now, whether it is ChatGPT or Claude or facial recognition or decision-making AIs, all of those AIs that we use right now fall into the category of weak AI. And what we mean by weak AI is that a weak AI is a system that has been trained to do one thing. And it could do that one thing really, really well, but it can't apply that one thing to other things, right? So facial recognition artificial intelligence, which can scan my face and go, that's Bo Young Lee, right? Out of a big database. That visual face ID, it can't be applied to identifying birds, right? I could tell it, try to find a cardinal, and cardinals have these attributes. It can't do it because it's only trained to do one thing. Versus a human, if a human can learn to like match faces, they can then, if I say, go find a cardinal, like a human has the mental flexibility and neural flexibility to do that. So everything that we do right now is weak AI. Eventually, the proponents of artificial intelligence believe that we're going to have artificial general intelligence, which is that flexibility. And then eventually, there's a belief that we're going to have what they call super AI, which is like exceeds, like is smarter and better and faster and everything, right? And if we are if we are watching these biases and these inequities being replicated in a weak form of artificial intelligence, what happens when we get to that artificial general intelligence? And then what happens when we get to like super intelligence? It's scary. And I've told everybody, you know, I didn't start this master's program being one of those tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists, but like there's a part of me that wants to wear that hat now, that like get that aluminum foil, crumple it up and stick it on my head and walk around all day. And you know, I have even gotten to the point where I don't even like having my photo taken anymore. Like
Wow, I
I
think
try to minimize. Yeah,
when I hear this story, it also makes me think about gender disparity, right? So women are not participating at the same levels in the creation of this technology. So how do you think that that's contributing to widening the gap of gender disparity?
absolutely. So there's been a huge history of women being excluded, not only just excluded, but actually intentionally written out of the computer science and the technology
Yes.
you know, narrative. And we know that the era when women had the highest representation in computer science wasn't yesterday, but it was in 1983. Women represented about 35% of all computer science graduates in 1983. And then that number started to decline, partially because of, or largely because of an intentional attempt to rewrite the story around a male narrative. Think about like, you know, the fact that women have been intentionally written out, and some of those stories are starting to come out, right? Like through the movie Hidden Figures and whatnot. But we know
Yes.
that the highest number of female representation in computer science was in 1983. It was about 35%. And then that number dropped to about 20%, around 20-ish% by 2004. So from 2004 to today, so that's about another 21 years, right? So it took about 20 years for that number to drop from 35 to 20. From 2004 to 2025, that number has not moved more than like, has moved up and down slightly, but it is wavered between 20 to 22% and then back down to 20. So we really haven't seen any progress in that. And that exclusion of women from computer science is even worse when we move into the artificial intelligence space. So one study I saw is that only about 15% of all machine learning researchers, the people who are developing and training artificial intelligence, only 15% are women. And if you think about, there's so many different ways to think about that exclusion. First and foremost, like women technologists are being excluded from what are fundamentally very lucrative roles. These machine learning researchers are getting paid like base salaries of $400,000 plus bonus, plus equity, plus all of that.
Yeah.
So just very superficially, they're being excluded from these really great technological opportunities. But more so than you think about, like, if women are not in the room, what is being ignored from a safety perspective, from a training perspective, from a design perspective? And then on top of that question of what is being ignored, there's actually been this manifestation of artificial AI generated women becoming more and more prominent online. Everything from, like, if you think about the way in which like all of the AI assistants are being vocalized, right? Siri, you know, Alexa. It was a very intentional choice to make those assistants female, because assistants are subordinate, and therefore people are more likely to adopt, you know, these vocalized personal assistants if they're female, because that's a subordinate role. So it's a reaffirmation of a societal gender stereotype. We know there's been a huge proliferation of AI generated female social influencers. You go on Instagram, there are thousands of female AI generated, and the vast majority of those AI generated women are controlled by male creators, male social media companies creating them. And there's several cases where these women are presented in these hypersexualized, hypergender, you know, heteronormative ways. They are, even though they're fictional and the users who interact with them know they're fictional, they are subject to the same exact harassment, sexual harassment, sexual violence language that real women get. And these AI bots are just like, whatever, I'll be sexually harassed online. And girls and women see this online, right? And so the exclusion of women, everything from being excluded from good jobs, not being able to influence how AI is developed, trained, and what kind of safety protocols are put in place, and then how AI generated synthetic women are portrayed. All of that influences the world we live in. And we know that there is a very concerning trend around boys in our society, boys who are failing, boys who are lagging in education, from an educational perspective as compared to girls, boys who are being sucked into these misogyny traps.
And is that
like
boys in general, or is that white boys?
So that's a really interesting question, right? I think boys have been lagging for a long time, but the canary in the coal mine were the Black boys. And we know that Black boys have been struggling in school, and they're being penalized in school for decades now. And social activists have been raising their hand. Same thing for Latino boys as well. It's been decades. But I think the concern around the failing of boys is only becoming popular now, so to speak, because it is white boys, and because it is middle class white boys, really, and middle class and upper class boys who are falling behind. And I want to be super clear. I feel for these boys. And I actually think that feminism did fail in that we didn't address the boys from the very beginning. So I don't want to be like, I don't care about the boys just because now it's white boys. Like, I care about the boys, but I care about all the boys. And if we're going to address the needs of boys, we need to create solutions that are for the Black boys, and for the Latino boys, and for the South Pacific boys, and for the white boys. And the way in which boys are engaging with these synthetic women online, it's exacerbating the problem. Because these synthetic women and the way women are being represented by artificial is so unrealistic. It actually creates a psychological barrier for when boys start interacting with girls, because their peers, these boys and these young men, their female peers are becoming more progressive. There's actually research. Pew has done some research. A few other research institutions have seen this, where girls and boys are drifting further and further apart in their political, social ideology, and then these boys are falling more into these stereotype views of women, synthetic women, and it just creates more of a barrier for their interaction with women in the real world.
I mean, from what you're describing to me, it feels like a logical conclusion that DEI is, if not more important today than it's been in the past. And yet, we're dealing with a huge backlash to DEI from the administration, and it's also erupting in society. What's your view on this? On people trying to now discount DEI, calling it illegal DEI, and really weaponizing the narrative of what DEI is really supposed to be?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I want to say, I think there's so many different dynamics here, but first and foremost, DEI is the new boogeyman, right? And we've seen this before. A few years ago, critical race theory was everyone's boogeyman. When was the last time Trump criticized critical race theory? Right?
Yeah.
We haven't heard about CRT in a couple of years, right? And that's because DEI is the new boogeyman. And before critical race theory, it was something else, and it was something else, and it was something else. That is one thing, is I'm not going to politicize this, and I'm not going to say one party does this and one party does that. But the individuals who are scared of progress, the individuals who are unwilling to accept that we live in a diverse world, period, and who believe that in some way we can de-diversify this country, right? And de-diversify the world. And we all go back into our little countries and build our walls, like the Great Wall of China and stuff like that. Those people who think that reality can occur, which it can't, they need an easy whipping post. And DEI is that whipping post. But I will say The one thing is, I think I've heard you say this, I've heard other people say that, like DEI to a certain extent is a victim of its own hype, right? I think there's a part of me, and I know this is a controversial take, there's a part of me that I wish 2020 had never happened. Because I feel like what happened in 2020 is that it became such a popular movement to embrace DEI that you saw a lot of companies and a lot of organizations that should never have embraced DEI do it, but they did it in the most performative way possible, in the most like horse and pony show way possible. And so what people started thinking of as DEI were these very stupid, I'll say stupid, very stupid, superficial actions. And there are so many great practitioners out there, so much strategic work being done within companies, and all of that got pushed to the side for these very performative actions and these very performative statements. And I think it was that made the work of DEI so easy to criticize. And having done this work for so long, like you, Evelyn, and having done it during an era where no one cared about it. Not only did they not care about it, they didn't understand it. Like when it
at all.
Back, yeah, in 2005 and 2006, when I would explain what I did for a living, people were like, so you go to companies and you look around and you basically tell them to treat people better and you get paid for that. And I'm like, kinda. Like I said, I've always said that my job was always to appeal to everyone's higher angel.
Oh.
Is to get people to think about, if you were not born in that package that you are born in, whether it's male or female or blah, 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 and you had to construct a world, how would you construct a world so that everyone had the opportunity to succeed? And you're not a white man, you're not a white woman, you're not a Black person. How would you design it? And I go, that's what I'm helping people design.
Yeah.
Right. And people didn't know it. And the great thing is that since people didn't understand it, they were just like, okay, go and do your thing. And during that period of time, I felt like there was so much room for experimentation and so much room for progress and so much room for making mistakes along the way. But that's how we made the progress so fast. But now that there's such a lens on the work, the thing I really feel so bad for the newer, younger practitioners is they don't have room to breathe, let alone make a mistake.
That's right. The results are expected immediately. And it's not even clear that they even have the skills or experience to be able to know what path to take forward in order to get those results.
Right. And they can't even have, they don't even have the opportunity to say, I think I'm lacking in this skill set. Like I've met practitioners. I hired somebody years ago who was such a great practitioner and knew everything about the LGBTQIA community, back and forth. Their experience with racial ethnic diversity, minimal. So you know what I said to them? I said, in the first year that I hired them, I said, you are not going to do a lick of LGBTQIA work. You're not going to do anything with gender. But I'm going to make you do every project that has to do with racial ethnic diversity. And you're going to be super uncomfortable. And you're going to probably use some language that it shouldn't be used. And that's how you're going to learn about it. And they came back to me a year later going, I really hated you a year ago. You took me out of my comfort zone. But they're like, but now I know what you're doing. And they're like, now I'm going to do this with my team members. You can't do that anymore to somebody. Because that person will be, they can't, because that, if I put somebody in front of a group and they make a mistake, they're going to get canceled. And I can't do that to a young practitioner. Yeah, there's no safety anymore in it. And I think that if I could change one thing, other than, of course, everything, but if I could change one thing, I almost wish that there was a little less of a spotlight so that the good work can still continue.
I do completely agree with that. And it makes me think about, honestly, what's the data that DEI practitioners need in their toolbox so that they're able to not only tell the right narrative, but focus the work on the right areas so that it's not just performative and what's the holiday calendar.
Yeah, exactly. So this was a question I always asked my teams, regardless of the company I was working at. And I would ask them periodically, especially when the team has done a lot of hiring or there's been some turnover and I have some new folks on my team. I would always ask and this is very much a question for corporate DEI practitioners, and I want to be super clear about that. I would always ask my teams, I'm like, why are you here? Why are you working here? And they would usually give me answers like, oh, to create more equity, to create more, to ensure that, women are getting promoted more, or, making sure that our LGBTQ employees feel seen and heard. And I would always stop them after a few answers. And I would say, those are all really nice answers, but I'm like, they're all wrong. You are here and you're employed by a for-profit corporation that is traded on the stock exchange because you're here to help the company make money. That's your single goal. And and you can see my bias, right? I have an MBA. So like, and you learn when you're getting your MBA that like, executives in a business have a fiduciary responsibility to increase shareholder value. But what I would say to my team, because I'd always see them getting like really like concerned when I would start this answer. So I'm like, your job is to help the organization make money through greater diversity of product services, customer engagement, and ensuring that truly the best talent, regardless of background and identity, makes it to the top of the organization. Because we know in the current system, we're not serving all of our customers equally. We're not, we don't have, we're not always thinking about the safety and concerns of everybody. And great talent is being left behind in the organization because we don't have equitable systems. So the way in which you ensure that both you're helping to increase new opportunities, manage liability, and identify true great talent. That's what you're doing. And that helps the organization make money. And so when it comes to that question, and the reason why I start with that answer is because when it comes to the question of what data does a DEI practitioner in a corporation need, I always say, how is the organization making money? What money are they leaving on the table? What audiences have they not captured as fully as they can because of what they do? And for most tech companies, the answer is quite simple. You have probably left everyone who is over the age of 50. You have probably underpenetrated the 50 plus market because everybody in this tech company is 25 years old and like super young, and you don't know how a 50-year-old thinks. Right. I see people on, I used, prior to joining NEW, I was the chief diversity officer at Uber, and it would kill me every single time. And I live in New York City. It would kill me every single time I would watch like this 60-year-old woman standing on the corner in the rain, trying to flag down a taxi cab. And I wanted to walk over to her and just be like, let me introduce you to Uber. And guess what? I talked with our designers. So now the font is a font that you can actually read. I remember the first time when I joined Uber, the first thing I asked our product team, and I said to them, I'm like, can you please change the font in the app so that someone who can read it without having to put on reading glasses? Because I'm only 42, but I can barely read the font. So someone who's 60 probably can. And they did. They actually made the font much, much bigger. So like, I would say, what should you have in your bag? One, first, understand how your company makes money. And then two, what money are they leaving off the table? That becomes the basis of your strategy. Then you actually need to understand who is in your organization. I think one of the things that I'm seeing a lot right now with this whole backlash against DEI and the work being kind of overtaken by people who are trying to manage liability, like, so a lot of lawyers, a lot of PR folks, a lot of comms folks, a lot of policy folks, is there's this kind of weird backward belief that the less data we have, the less liable we are. And so I'm starting to see organizations strip away data access. And I'm hearing this from practitioners saying, oh, yes, the employment law team took away my access to all the data. And I'm like, do you understand that by doing that, you're not managing liability and risk, you're enhancing it? Because it's, despite all the executive orders, it's still illegal to pay people inequitably. It is still illegal to discriminate. It is still illegal to have disparate impact when you're doing a layoff, for example. And if you're not examining the data, it's being created under your nose without you being aware that it's there.
It's the ostrich defense. You just bury your head in the ground and don't actually have access to the information. And then you can't be said that you deliberately managed your process in a way that gave you those outcomes, which I think it brings me to this thought around what is the real work that the DEI practitioner has? Is it profitability for the organization, or do they have some responsibility to deal with issues of white supremacy, to deal with issues of internalized racism and internalized oppression and institutionalized racism? If I'm a practitioner going into this field, that feels like a heavy responsibility to be on me. But it also feels like, how could I possibly be thinking that I'm making an impact on profitability when I'm not dealing with these inherent issues that are sort of part of the primordial soup that we're all sitting in?
Absolutely. I mean, my answer to that is both, right? Like, we are held back as a society by white supremacy, right? We are just in the same way, societies that are deeply sexist are held back by misogyny and sexism. And I'm Korean, so I'll use a very Korean example. South Korea is in dire straits right now because it has the single lowest birth rate of any country in the world. The birth rate right now in South Korea is 0.7 per woman. The replacement rate for economically developed countries like South Korea is 2.1. So in order to even replace their citizenry, South Korea women would have to be having 2.1. But women are making the choice not to have children in South Korea. And there's people will say, oh, it's not just women making that choice. I'm like, no, in any society, it is the women who dictate what family size looks like. And South Korean women have made the choice because the level of discrimination that a woman faces when she gets pregnant, when she gets married, when she becomes a mother is so great. Women are making the trade-off and saying, I don't want to have children. That's dragging the whole economy down. There are fewer consumers. The population is actually in active decline. There are fewer young people to support the aging population, and the whole society suffers because Korean society refuses to move away from their very patriarchal, sexist views around maternity and women with children, right? So the entire society. Same thing is happening to the United States. The United States as a country is fundamentally founded on racialized capitalism, right? It is founded on a system of capitalism that was designed for a small number of people to become enriched, against the oppression and the stolen labor of a group of people. It started with slavery. And it is, we saw it happening in Jim Crow, and we saw it and now we see it through the lens of like the incarcerated population, right? There is a reason why the United States has the single highest rate of incarcerated people in the entire world, even though we have a incarcerated population size that is 12x that of China, despite China having a population that is 4 times larger than the United States. And this is not proportional. These are end counts. The United States has more human bodies in jail than all of China. And that is because that imprisoned population is free labor or very, 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 very cheap labor, right? So racialized capitalism is a reality in the United States, and it is what our country is built on. But what we're seeing right now is because we're moving into a plurality society, where very shortly in the next few decades or so, there will be no majority in the United States. And I tend to avoid the language of majority country, because that gives a false representation that like suddenly the entire country is like a bunch of minorities. You and I know Black people don't get along with Asian people, don't get along with Latino people. We're not, all the minoritized populations are not this unified cohort.
They're not monolithic, and they don't connect with each other naturally.
Yeah. So what I like to say is we're going to move into a plurality where white people will still be the plurality. They'll still be the largest. They may not be 59% like they are right now. They'll still be like 49%. They'll still be the largest group, right? Because I think that some of that language that we use misrepresent and causes fear within this racialized, capitalized system. And what we're seeing right now is because we are moving into this plurality society, the white supremacy is getting louder. The individuals who are afraid of white disenfranchisement, they are getting more violent. And what we're seeing is this incredible polarization in our society. So as much as people are uncomfortable talking about white supremacy, as much as people are uncomfortable talking about racialized capitalism, that is the conversation that we have to have in order to move past. Like, people are like, we just need to stop being so polarized. And I'm like, we cannot just stop being polarized. We have to confront, like, what is, like, whether it's AA, whether it's Narcotics Anonymous, like, what is the first principle of these programs to help heal people? It is radical self-acceptance. When you go into AA, not that I've ever been, but I've had family members and friends who've gone through these systems, they say the first thing you have to admit is, I'm an alcoholic and I will always be an alcoholic. I am a drug abuser and I will always be. And it's the same sort of thing. In order for the United States to heal, we have to say, we are a country built on racial capitalism. And we as a country have to atone for that and address it. And white people have to examine what it means to be white. Like, I think that's the hardest thing, is like, we allow whiteness to exist in this country without any interrogation. White people are just white people. They're just
right. It's just a default.
And every other minority group has to interrogate itself. Where did I come from? What's my history? How does that history and that legacy, how did that lead to generational trauma? What did I learn? What do I have to give up? What do I have to, like, where do I find my strength? Like, you, as you're a person of color, I'm a person of color. You and I have probably had to audit ourselves and our identity over and over and again. And I'm also a queer person. I'm a demisexual queer person, and I'm a mother, and I'm a dyslexic person, and I have physical disabilities. And each one of these parts of my identity have forced me to ask myself, how does that aspect of my identity shape who I am? White people don't ever get asked, how does being white shape who you are and your belief systems? And I'm actually in a biracial household. My husband is white, and I've had to, like, force him to look at, like, what does it mean for you to be white, but the fact that you're raising children who are not white. And when I asked him that, when I was pregnant with my first child, and I asked him that question, what does it mean for you to be raising children of color? He never thought about it that way before. He did not realize that some very, like, unconscious part of his brain just assumed his children would have access to all of his privileges. And it just doesn't work that way.
It reminds me of that saying that the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was making the world believe it didn't exist. And so there is this way that you can't fight something if you can't admit that it exists and that it's there.
Right.
And if I take that concept back, this is going to be my last question, because I know that I need to be mindful of your time. But if I take that question back to the work of a DEI practitioner, do you think that DEI practitioners should be bringing Black people together to talk about white supremacy for Black people? What does it mean for them to have Asian people talk about that, and have white people come together to talk about what does that mean for us and what's our responsibility?
100%. Like, so recently the news came out that the University of Arizona they were planning to shut down every single one of their cultural centers because it's unfair to have a center for Black people and for Asian people and for queer people. And I go, oh, no, that's not the way to approach this. You don't shut down all the cultural centers. You open a white cultural center.
There we go.
And you have them do the exact kind of conversations and the exact same programming and the exact same justification for existing that all the other things. Same thing for corporations. You should not be shut. If any corporation, any DEI practitioner is in a corporation where they are thinking about shutting down all the ERGs, and I'm just like, oh, no. If a white man comes to you and says, well, would you create a white male ERG? I'd be like, yes. And here's the guidebook. And here's how you submit for a budget. And here's the calendar of events that I'm expecting you to submit. And here's, you have to go get an executive sponsor. it is not to shut everything down. It is to hold that whiteness to the same standard that everyone
Hold
else
them
is being
accountable
held
as
to.
well. That's right.
Exactly.
And the journey may be different, right? Because the kind of I in the 90s I did these kinds of sessions of self-awareness for the Black community and the Latino community in the telephone company and for what's Verizon today. And what we found was that we took the same program that we were using with African Americans and used that with Latinos. And there's inevitably this moment when the senior executive comes into the room. And with the Black community, you're trying to make sure that you're holding a level of professionalism because they are really clear on the injustices that are going on in their organization. And they can speak to that with a level of clarity that the executive falls apart and can't handle it, right? So the executive can't be professional in that setting.
Mm-hmm.
If I then look at the Latino community, we have a very different orientation to what it means to have our race and the diaspora within it, right? So there are Latinos that see themselves as white and Latinos like myself that I see myself as Afro-Caribbean, right? And so the journey that they go through as a community starts first with getting to know why are we a community and are we a community? And then how do we then react to these issues within our organization? And I've never done one of those sessions for white people, but I honestly think that it has to, I've done it for white women in a women's leadership program where they just all happen to be white. And the big question was, so why are white women not able to support each other? Why is there not a sense of community among them? So I completely agree with you. And I'd love to see people like you working on bringing this element of whiteness to a broader, higher level of discussion, because to me, it feels like it's that unacknowledged element that we're not going to be able to fight and overcome if we can't even articulate that it exists.
Yeah, exactly. And I will end with one final story, but I think it's like the perfect cap to this conversation. I think, Evelyn, you're familiar with Ella Bell Smith.
Oh, yeah.
She's a professor at Dartmouth, and she's one of the very first academics to really examine like black and white women in the workplace. And she wrote one of the seminal books like in the 1980s that is still, I think, really relevant today. But so Ella Bell's really funny because she's like this like 70 something year old, like very intelligent, very opinionated Black woman. But one of her really good friends is the actress Gwyneth Paltrow, which I know it sounds crazy, but she was telling me this story once. I was with Ella about how she was having lunch with Gwyneth, and Gwyneth says to Ella, she goes, one thing I really, really envy about women of color and Black women is that when you are all together, you are all just so safe with each other and you are all so close and there's just like connectedness. And she goes, I just don't have that with my white women friends. She goes, I don't. She says, like, there's always feels like there's this competition between us. And so Ella and I were talking about this. And then like a few days later, I happened to be having lunch somewhere, I forget where. And there's this group of white women, about like 8 or 9 white women sitting like kind of catty corner to me, and I could hear their whole conversation because they're being really loud. And it was a group of people who clearly had gone to college with each other, their college girlfriends, and they were getting together for like their annual lunch or something. And the amount of tension I felt behind me, and I'm like totally like eavesdropping the whole time. I'm barely eating, and like my friend who I was having lunch with was like, "What are you doing?" And I think I was just like zoned out, like to see the women. But what I realized is that these women, there was such a clear hierarchy in that group. There was like the queen bee, and then there were her like, and then there was like the girl at the end who was like clearly like the bottom of the rung. And I realized in that moment that they were playing into every bit of white supremacy hierarchy. Because that's the one thing about white supremacy that we know about. White supremacy is fundamentally hierarchical. There's a leader and then there's subordinates. It's very vertical. Because because whiteness and European Anglo culture is very individualistic.
Yeah.
But when I'm with my Asian girlfriends, or when I'm with my Black girlfriends, my women of color girlfriends, like we all come from communal cultures where there is not that hierarchy. There isn't that individualism. And I'm like, that's why we feel like family. And I wrote to Ella, I'm like, Ella, I think I have a theory about what's going on here. But it's like that kind of examination, right? Like you said, like there's all this competition amongst white women, but they don't examine it, so they don't understand it. So I leave you with that story. Yeah, I leave you with that story because I think that the next amount of work, other than like all this stuff in artificial intelligence is this examination and this treatment of whiteness, like everything else that we do in DEI, and not to be afraid of that.
Excellent. I want to thank you so much for this conversation. I feel enlightened and inspired. I feel a lot of energy around what we've talked about. And these are very tough subjects to delve into.
Yeah.
Your level of clarity and knowledge of the history and really understanding what it's going to take to move the needle on these is just phenomenal. Thank you so much for giving me your time and for helping our viewers to think about these subjects in such a clear and concise way.
Thank you so much for having me. And this is such a great podcast. I've had so much fun listening to some of your past podcasts. I know that you have a really special one coming up after me, so I'm looking forward to that as well.
Yes. So to our listeners, we do have our next podcast is going to be focused on issues related to white supremacy with Tim Wise. So for those of you that don't know, he's a critical race thinker. He's an activist, and really somebody that has just such incredible knowledge around some of the topics that we've been talking about today. So I'm excited to bring him to you next month as well.
Thank you.
Great, Bo. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye-bye.